Dr. Arthur Mendonça walked confidently through the brightly lit corridors of the hospital. He was a man used to being respected, feared even. His reputation as a skilled surgeon was well known, and no one dared to challenge his authority. Patients, colleagues, and even the nursing staff were all aware of his strict demeanor and unyielding standards. To him, being a doctor meant maintaining control, making the right decisions, and never showing weakness. Empathy, for Arthur, was a luxury he couldn't afford. After all, he believed that saving lives was more important than making friends. As he moved from one patient to another, Arthur's mind wandered to his recent conversation with the hospital's director. Complaints had been piling up about his bedside manner, and the director had warned him to be more sensitive with patients. Arthur scoffed at the memory. What do they expect from me? I'm here to save lives, not to play the role of a counselor. He muttered to himself as he prepared for another round of consultations. The day was moving quickly, and Arthur was called into the emergency room for a new patient. When he arrived, he saw a man, black, modestly dressed, and visibly in pain. The man was sitting on a gurney, holding his side, his face twisted with discomfort. Arthur glanced at the chart briefly, hardly bothering to take in the details of the patient's condition. "What seems to be the problem?" Arthur asked, barely looking at the man. The patient struggled to speak, his breath shallow, but Arthur interrupted before he could finish. "Can you afford the treatment here?" The question landed harshly, cutting through the air like a knife. The man blinked, taken aback by the suddenness of the question, but said nothing. Arthur continued without waiting for a response. "This is a private hospital. If you can't pay, I suggest you seek treatment elsewhere." The nurses exchanged nervous glances, clearly uncomfortable with how Arthur was handling the situation, but no one spoke up. Arthur was a senior doctor, after all. They knew better than to challenge him. Arthur, oblivious to the tension in the room, continued his examination in a mechanical, impersonal manner. He poked and prodded the patient without much regard for his pain or comfort. "I'll order some tests," Arthur said curtly, stepping back from the gurney. "We'll see if it's worth proceeding with treatment." The patient looked at Arthur, but remained silent. There was something in the man's eyes, something calm, almost knowing, that Arthur couldn't quite place. It made him feel uneasy, though he would never admit that to anyone, not even to himself. Arthur turned to leave the room, already mentally moving on to his next patient, when the man's wife walked in. She was dressed simply, like her husband, and she had a pleading look in her eyes. "Please, doctor," she said, her voice soft but filled with urgency. "My husband needs help. We can pay. Just please help him." Arthur waved her off impatiently. "I've already ordered the tests. We'll see." As he walked out, Arthur could feel the eyes of both the patient and his wife following him. But he didn't care. To him, they were just another case, another set of problems to deal with. They were not his priority. Unbeknownst to Arthur, this was a day that would change his life forever. Arthur left the emergency room and made his way to the doctor's lounge. His mind was already shifting focus from the patient he had just seen. To him, the man was like many others who passed through the hospital doors, another individual he would likely never see again after the day was over. He grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down for a moment of quiet before heading back to his rounds. The hospital was always busy, but Arthur had learned to work through the noise, the chaos, and the stress. As he sipped his coffee, the nurses outside the emergency room were still talking about the patient. One of the younger nurses, Clara, spoke softly to her colleague. "I really don't like how Dr. Arthur treated that man. He was so dismissive, and he didn't even bother to ask the man about his pain." "Yeah," the other nurse replied. "But what can we do? He's been like this for years, and no one challenges him. He's the top surgeon here." Clara sighed, but knew the truth in her colleague's words. Arthur's reputation for being difficult wasn't new, and yet the hospital tolerated him because of his skill. He saved lives, but at what cost to his patient's dignity? That question lingered in Clara's mind as she glanced back at the patient, who was now lying quietly on the gurney, waiting for his test results. Meanwhile, Arthur returned to his rounds, oblivious to the conversations behind his back. He saw himself as beyond reproach. As he went through his day, handling one patient after another, his mind barely registered the man from earlier in the emergency room. He had already classified the case as unimportant, just another person who wouldn't be able to pay, in his estimation. Later in the day, Arthur crossed paths with the hospital's director in the hallway. The director, a middle-aged man with a calm but authoritative demeanor, stopped Arthur. "Arthur, I've been hearing some more complaints," he began carefully. "We've had patients express dissatisfaction with your bedside manner again." Arthur stiffened, his usual response when he felt his authority was being questioned. "My job is to save lives, not to coddle people," he replied bluntly. "I understand that," the director said, "but we need to remember that patients are more than just cases to solve. They deserve respect, regardless of who they are." Arthur frowned. "I treat everyone the same, but not everyone can afford the kind of care we provide here, and that's just the reality." The director sighed, clearly not getting through to Arthur. "Just think about what I said," he added before walking away. Arthur shook his head in frustration, not wanting to dwell on the conversation. He believed he was doing the right thing, focusing on what mattered most: results. If patients felt hurt or insulted, that wasn't his problem. As the day progressed, Arthur was called back to the emergency room to check on the man. The test results were ready, and he needed to assess whether further treatment was necessary. When he arrived, the man was still lying there, quiet as before. His wife stood by his side, holding his hand, her eyes filled with worry. Arthur glanced at the test results, barely showing any concern. "Well," he began, "it doesn't look too serious. We can treat this, but as I said earlier, you'll need to make arrangements to cover the cost of the treatment." The man remained silent, but his wife spoke up again, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, doctor, we will find a way. Just help him." Arthur looked at her, his face emotionless. "I'll begin the process, but I'm warning you, this treatment isn't cheap." As Arthur walked away again, the same uneasy feeling from earlier returned. Something about the way the patient and his wife were handling the situation didn't sit right with him. Why weren't they arguing or begging more? Why wasn't the man defending himself? Little did Arthur know, the truth would soon come to light, and it would turn his world upside down. Arthur returned to his office, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had followed him from the emergency room. He prided himself on being logical, focused on facts and not emotions. Yet, something about that patient, the man who remained so calm in the face of his dismissive treatment, was nagging at him. Arthur couldn't understand why. He wasn't used to second-guessing himself, and the fact that he was starting to do so now irritated him. As he sat at his desk reviewing some paperwork, his thoughts drifted back to the interaction. He replayed the scene in his mind. The man had said very little, but his eyes had spoken volumes. Arthur remembered those eyes, calm, almost knowing, as if the patient was aware of something Arthur wasn't. And that look, the one he gave Arthur, had lingered longer than it should have. It had made Arthur uncomfortable, though he wouldn't admit it to anyone. Why had the man stayed so silent? Most patients would have been desperate to prove they could pay or would have demanded better treatment. But not him. He had just waited. Outside Arthur's office, Clara, the young nurse, was talking with her colleagues. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way Dr. Arthur had treated the man still bothered her. She had seen the patient's medical records and knew something that Arthur, in his arrogance, had overlooked, something that might change everything. Clara gathered the courage to approach Arthur's office. She hesitated at the door, knowing that Dr. Arthur wasn't the easiest person to talk to. Still, she knocked gently. "Come in," Arthur's voice called from inside. Clara stepped into the office, holding the patient's chart in her hands. Arthur barely looked up, his eyes still fixed on the papers in front of him. "Dr. Arthur," she began cautiously, "I was just reviewing the medical history of the patient you saw earlier in the emergency room." Arthur finally glanced up, his expression indifferent. "What about it?" he asked, sounding uninterested. "Well," Clara continued, choosing her words carefully, "there's something I think you should know. The patient, he's not just anyone. His name is Dr. Henrique Silva." Arthur frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to place the name. "Why should that mean anything to me?" he asked, his tone still dismissive. Clara shifted nervously, but pressed on. "Dr. Silva is a highly respected surgeon. He's worked in some of the best hospitals in the country. In fact, he's saved many lives, including the life of a very important person to you." Arthur's heart skipped a beat, though he didn't let it show on his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice sharp. Clara hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "Dr. Hop Silva is the surgeon who saved your son's life after that car accident several years ago." For a moment, there was silence. Arthur's mind raced as the words sank in. The car accident. His son had been critically injured, and it had been a miracle that he survived. He had never met the surgeon who performed the operation, but he had always been told that it was one of the best in the field. Now, Clara was telling him that the man he had humiliated earlier that day was the same surgeon who had saved his son's life. Arthur sat back in his chair, stunned. He felt a wave of emotions that he hadn't experienced in years. Shock, guilt, and shame all rolled into one. He had treated Dr. Silva like any other patient, like someone beneath him, when in fact, that man had performed the greatest act of kindness anyone could have done for him. Arthur had allowed his prejudice and arrogance to blind him to the truth. Clara stood awkwardly, sensing that she had delivered a bombshell. Arthur said nothing for a long moment, staring blankly at his desk. "Thank you, Clara," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded and left the office, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like never before. For the first time in a long time, Arthur felt something he had thought himself incapable of: regret. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he would have to face the consequences of his arrogance. Arthur sat in his office, staring blankly at the papers on his desk, but his mind was far from his work. The revelation that Dr. Henrique Silva, the man he had belittled and humiliated, was the very surgeon who had saved his son's life years ago, weighed heavily on him. The realization hit him like a wave, pulling him under with guilt and shame. How had he been so blind? How could he have let his arrogance cloud his judgment so completely? He tried to focus, flipping through patient files and reports, but the image of Dr. Silva's calm, knowing eyes kept haunting him. Those eyes hadn't been filled with anger or resentment, even after Arthur had spoken to him with such disrespect. Instead, they had been filled with something much more powerful: understanding. Dr. Silva knew who Arthur was all along. He had known and yet said nothing, allowing Arthur to dig his own grave with his words. The weight of it all was unbearable. Arthur couldn't stay in his office any longer. He stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and headed back toward the emergency room. His mind raced as he walked through the familiar corridors of the hospital, but this time everything felt different. The power and control he usually exuded were gone, replaced by uncertainty and shame. He didn't know what he was going to say to Dr. Silva, but he knew he couldn't let the day end without confronting the situation. When he arrived at the emergency room, he saw Dr. Silva still lying on the gurney, his wife seated beside him. She looked up as Arthur entered the room, her eyes filled with concern, but also with a quiet strength. Dr. Silva's expression hadn't changed. He was calm, composed, and seemed almost at peace with what had transpired. Arthur felt his heart pounding in his chest as he approached them. His usual confidence had evaporated, leaving him unsure of how to begin. For the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable, exposed. "Dr. Silva," Arthur began, his voice unsteady, "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." Dr. Silva looked up at him, his expression unchanged. "And would it have made a difference if you did?" he asked softly, his voice calm and measured. Arthur was taken aback by the question. He opened his mouth to respond, but found that no words came out. Would it have made a difference? Would he have treated Dr. Risturdi Silva with respect if he had known from the beginning who he was? The truth was painful, but Arthur knew the answer. No, it wouldn't have. His prejudice had blinded him, and he had let his assumptions dictate his actions. "I was wrong," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I treated you with disrespect, and for that I am deeply sorry." Dr. Silva regarded him quietly for a moment before speaking again. "You didn't just disrespect me, Dr. Mendonça. You disrespected the profession we both serve. Our duty is to care for others, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Arthur nodded, unable to argue with the truth in Dr. Silva's words. He felt a deep shame rising in his chest, but there was nothing he could say to justify his actions. "I've let my arrogance get in the way," Arthur admitted, the words coming out slowly, as though they were unfamiliar to him. "I've been so focused on my own status and reputation that I forgot what it means to be a doctor, to really care for people. Dr. Silva's wife remained silent, watching the exchange between the two men. Arthur could feel the weight of her gaze on him, and it only deepened his sense of regret. Dr. Silva finally broke the silence. What's important now is how you choose to move forward. We all make mistakes, Dr. Mendonça. What matters is whether we learn from them. Arthur swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I want to make things right, he said. Not just with you, but with myself, with my patients. I don't want to be that kind of doctor anymore. Dr. Silva gave him a small nod, his expression softening slightly. Then start by treating every patient with the dignity and respect they deserve. It's never too late to change. Arthur felt a sense of relief wash over him, though the guilt still lingered. He had been given a chance to redeem himself, but it wouldn't be easy. Change never was. He looked at Dr. Silva, grateful for the lesson he had been forced to learn, and for the grace with which the man had handled the entire situation. As Arthur turned to leave the room, he paused at the door. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Thank you for saving my son's life. Dr. Silva simply nodded, offering Arthur a small but meaningful smile. Without another word, Arthur left the room, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, but determined to be a better doctor and a better man. Arthur left the room, his mind still reeling from the conversation with Dr. Silva. As he walked through the hospital corridors, he couldn't stop replaying the events of the day in his head. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he was left grappling with the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, exposed to the reality that his attitude had been hurting more than helping. He couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. Not just because he had insulted a fellow doctor, but because Dr. Silva had saved his son's life, and he had repaid that act of kindness with cruelty. Arthur felt a deep sense of shame for having let his biases and prejudices influence his treatment of patients, especially someone as skilled and respected as Dr. Silva. The shame was heavy, and it hung over him as he moved through the day. Back in his office, Arthur sat in his chair, his mind racing. His thoughts kept returning to his son, the car accident that had almost taken his life. He remembered the desperate panic he had felt, standing in the waiting room, not knowing if his son would survive. The surgery had been long and complicated, but when the surgeon came out and told Arthur that his son would live, it had felt like a miracle. Arthur had always been grateful to the surgeon, though he had never learned his name. Now he knew, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on him. He had to make things right, not just with Dr. Silva, but with himself and his profession. Arthur had spent so many years focused on his own success, his own reputation, that he had forgotten why he became a doctor in the first place: to help people. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that sense of purpose, and it had been replaced by a cold professionalism that left little room for empathy or compassion. As the hours passed, Arthur knew that he couldn't go on the same way he had before. He had to change, but he wasn't sure where to start. His mind drifted back to the conversation with Dr. Silva, to the calm yet firm way the man had spoken to him. There was no anger, no resentment, only a quiet wisdom that Arthur couldn't ignore. Dr. Silva had given him something that many people in his position would not have: a second chance. Arthur decided that he needed to apologize properly, not just to Dr. Silva, but to the staff, the patients, and even to himself. It wasn't enough to feel regret. He needed to act on it. He needed to be better. As he sat in his office, the door opened, and Clara, the nurse who had informed him about Dr. Silva's identity, entered hesitantly. Arthur looked up, a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment flashing across his face. "Clara," he began, "I want to thank you. If you hadn't told me the truth about Dr. Silva, I would have continued treating him, and probably others, without respect. I've been wrong, and I see that now." Clara nodded, a bit taken aback by the change in Arthur's demeanor. "I'm just glad you know now. It's never too late to make things right." Arthur smiled weakly. "You're right. I've got a lot of making up to do, starting with Dr. Silva, but also with the way I've treated people here. I've let my ego get in the way for too long." Clara seemed relieved to hear his words. "We all make mistakes, Dr. Mendonça. The important thing is that we learn from them." Arthur nodded. "I plan to. I'm not sure how long it will take, but I'm going to try to be better." After Clara left, Arthur took a deep breath. He knew he needed to speak to Dr. Silva again, not just to apologize, but to offer something more. He had spent years building his career on the backs of others, and now it was time to show real humility. He wasn't sure how Dr. Silva would react, but he knew that the only way forward was to face this head-on. Arthur stood up, gathered his thoughts, and left his office once again. He knew this conversation would be different from the last. This time, it wouldn't be about making excuses or justifying his actions. It would be about taking responsibility. As he walked down the corridor toward the emergency room, Arthur felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was about to confront not only Dr. Silva, but also the worst parts of himself. It was a confrontation long overdue, but one he was finally ready to face. Arthur made his way back to the emergency room, his steps slower this time, burdened by the weight of what he had to do. His mind was clearer now, but the guilt still lingered heavily in his chest. He had been wrong, so deeply wrong, and now he had to face the man he had disrespected once more. But this time, there would be no arrogance, no excuses, only the truth. When he reached the emergency room, Dr. Silva was still there, lying on the gurney with his wife by his side. She looked up as Arthur entered, her expression guarded, unsure of what to expect. Arthur could see the concern in her eyes, but also a quiet strength, the same kind of strength Dr. Silva had shown during their earlier conversation. Dr. Silva turned his head slightly, acknowledging Arthur's presence, but said nothing. His calm demeanor hadn't changed, though Arthur could now see the depth behind it. Patience, wisdom, and perhaps even a willingness to forgive, though that wasn't something Arthur was ready to assume. Arthur took a deep breath and stepped closer. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke. Dr. Silva, I need to apologize properly, not just for how I treated you today, but for the kind of person I've become. I've let my pride and my status as a surgeon blind me to what really matters, helping people, no matter who they are. Dr. Silva listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Arthur continued, feeling the need to lay everything out in the open. When my son was in that car accident, I was terrified. I didn't know if he would survive, and then I was told that a skilled surgeon had saved his life. I've been grateful ever since, but I never knew who you were. If I had known... Arthur paused, catching himself. No, it shouldn't have mattered who you were. The truth is, I should have treated you with respect from the moment I saw you, regardless of anything else. Dr. Silva's wife remained silent, but her expression softened slightly. Arthur could feel the tension in the room begin to ease, though he knew he still had a long way to go to truly make amends. I've spent too long letting my arrogance define me, Arthur admitted. I've treated people like they were beneath me, and I'm ashamed of that now. You've shown me something today, something important. You reminded me of why I became a doctor in the first place, and for that, I'm grateful. Dr. Silva's gaze softened as he finally spoke. It's not easy to face the truth about ourselves, Dr. Mendonça, but acknowledging it is the first step toward change. Arthur nodded, feeling a sense of relief, but also knowing that the road to redemption would be long. He had to prove, not just with words, but with actions, that he had changed. I want to make things right, Arthur said. Not just with you, but with my patients, my colleagues. I need to be better. Doctor, Silva regarded him for a moment before speaking again. The most important thing is that you've recognized where you went wrong. It's never too late to become the doctor and the person you were meant to be. Arthur felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though the guilt still lingered in the background. He knew it would take time to fully forgive himself for how he had behaved, but hearing Dr. Silva's words gave him hope. Thank you, Arthur said sincerely. Thank you for your kindness and for your patience with me. I don't deserve it, but I will do my best to live up to it. Dr. Silva nodded, offering Arthur a small, encouraging smile. Just remember, he said, our profession is about more than skill. It's about humanity. Every person who walks through these doors deserves the same respect and care. Arthur took those words to heart. He had always known, deep down, that medicine was about more than surgeries and diagnoses. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that truth. Now, it was time to reclaim it. As Arthur turned to leave the room, he paused at the door and looked back at Dr. Silva. I will do better, he promised. I will be better. Dr. Silva gave him a nod of understanding. I believe you. With that, Arthur left the room, knowing that this was just the beginning of his journey toward redemption. He had a lot to learn and even more to unlearn, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to take that step. Arthur walked away from the emergency room, his mind swirling with a mixture of emotions. The conversation with Dr. Silva had given him a sense of relief, but it had also opened up a deeper reflection on who he had become. For years, he had built a reputation as one of the top surgeons in the hospital, but in doing so, he had lost his way. His pride had made him blind to the very people he had sworn to care for. As he moved through the hospital corridors, he began to notice things he had ignored for too long. The weary faces of patients in the waiting room, the nurses rushing to and from rooms, the small, unspoken connections between staff and patients. For so long, he had seen the hospital as a place where he performed his duties with precision. But now he saw it differently. It was a place filled with people who needed compassion, not just treatment. Arthur reached his office and sat down heavily in his chair. He stared at the empty desk in front of him, his thoughts still consumed by the day's events. It wasn't enough to simply apologize to Dr. Silva. He had to change, truly change, and it wouldn't happen overnight. His past behavior had created a barrier between him and the rest of the hospital staff, a barrier he wasn't sure how to break down. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, remembering the early days of his career. He had been so full of passion, eager to help people and make a difference. But as the years passed, success had come with a cost. The more recognition he received, the more he had distanced himself from the very reason he had chosen this path in the first place. The patients had become cases, and his compassion had been replaced by cold efficiency. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Clara, the young nurse who had helped reveal the truth about Dr. Silva. She stood in the doorway, looking slightly hesitant but determined. "Dr. Mendonça," she began, "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." Arthur was surprised by her concern. He hadn't expected anyone to care about how he was feeling, especially not a nurse. For years, he had kept his interactions with the staff to a minimum, seeing them as merely part of the hospital machine. But Clara's gesture touched him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I'm managing," Arthur replied, his voice softer than usual. "It's been a long day, and I've had a lot to think about." Clara nodded and stepped further into the office. "I know it's not easy to confront these kinds of things, but I want you to know that I respect the fact that you're trying. A lot of people wouldn't." Her words caught Arthur off guard. For so long, he had been used to being the one in control, the one who never needed validation or support from others. But now, hearing this small kindness from Clara felt like a lifeline. "Thank you, Clara," he said, sincerity lacing his words. "I've been wrong for a long time. I know it'll take more than just words to fix things, but I'm going to do everything I can to make it right." Clara smiled gently. "That's all anyone can ask. We're all here to help each other, after all." Arthur was struck by the simplicity of her statement. It was true, yet he had forgotten it somewhere along the way. The hospital wasn't just a place for surgeries and medical procedures. It was a community, one where every person, from the doctors to the patients, played an important role. After Clara left, Arthur sat in silence for a long time, thinking about what he needed to do next. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. He had let his pride and ambition take control of his life, but now he had the chance to set things right. He couldn't change the past, but he could control what he did from this moment forward. Arthur decided that he needed to start small. He couldn't expect everyone in the hospital to suddenly trust him just because he had a change of heart. But he could begin by treating each patient with the respect and dignity they deserved, regardless of their background or appearance. He would make it a point to listen, to truly listen, to their concerns, instead of dismissing them as inconveniences. He would also work on rebuilding relationships with his colleagues. For so long, he had kept himself at a distance, thinking he didn't need anyone's approval or friendship. But now he realized that he did need them, perhaps more than he had ever understood. Arthur stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. He knew it would take time to make amends, but for the first time in years, He felt ready to begin. Arthur woke up the next morning with a new sense of purpose. The weight of the previous day still lingered, but rather than feeling overwhelmed, he felt determined to make real changes. He had spent too many years building walls around himself, walls made of pride, arrogance, and detachment. Now, he was ready to start tearing those walls down, brick by brick. He arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, wanting to face the day head-on. As he walked through the corridors, he noticed the familiar faces of his colleagues, many of whom avoided eye contact or gave him only polite nods. Arthur had built a reputation over the years, and he knew that earning their trust back wouldn't happen overnight. But he was ready to start the process. His first stop of the day was the emergency room. He wanted to check on Dr. Silva, not only to ensure his recovery, but to continue mending the broken bridge between them. When Arthur walked in, he saw Dr. Silva sitting up in bed, looking much better than the day before. His wife was by his side, and they both turned to Arthur as he approached. "Good morning, Dr. Silva." Arthur greeted him with a respectful nod. "I wanted to check on you and see how you're feeling today." Dr. Silva smiled, a gesture that instantly put Arthur at ease. "I'm feeling much better, thank you. The treatment has worked, and I should be able to go home soon." Arthur nodded, relieved to hear the news. "That's good to hear. I just wanted to say again how grateful I am for your patience with me. I know I have a lot to work on, but I hope to show you and everyone else that I'm serious about changing." Dr. Silva regarded him thoughtfully for a moment before speaking. "I believe you, Dr. Mendonça. Change isn't easy, but it's clear that you've taken the first step. Just remember that it's a continuous process. The way we treat others reflects who we are, not just in the big moments, but in the small ones too." Arthur felt the truth of Dr. Silva's words deeply. He nodded once again. "Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." After exchanging a few more words, Arthur left the room feeling lighter, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The path ahead was still long, but with Dr. Silva's encouragement, he felt more prepared to face it. As the day progressed, Arthur made a conscious effort to act more meaningfully with the hospital staff and his patients. When he entered a room, he didn't rush through the exams like he used to. Instead, he listened carefully to each patient, asked thoughtful questions, and made sure they felt heard and respected. It was a small shift, but one that was already beginning to make a difference. One patient, an elderly woman who had come in for a routine checkup, looked at Arthur with surprise after he spent extra time with her. "You're different today, doctor," she said, her voice soft but curious. "You're taking your time." Arthur smiled at her, feeling both grateful and humbled. "Yes, I am," he admitted. "I realize that I haven't always been as attentive as I should be, and I'm trying to do better." The woman smiled back at him, her eyes warm. "It's never too late to change, you know? People always appreciate kindness." Her words stayed with Arthur for the rest of the day. He moved through his rounds, making sure to apply that philosophy to every interaction. When he spoke with the nurses, he was more patient and respectful, acknowledging their expertise and thanking them for their hard work. He hadn't realized how much he had taken them for granted over the years, but now he was determined to show them the respect they deserved. Toward the end of his shift, Clara, the young nurse who had helped reveal the truth about Dr. Silva, approached him again. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps. "Dr. Mendonça," she said, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. "I've noticed a change in you today. You're different." Arthur smiled, though it was tinged with a bit of self-reflection. "I've realized that I've been wrong for a long time, Clara. I've let my pride get in the way of being the kind of doctor and the kind of person I should be. I'm trying to make things right." Clara nodded, clearly impressed by his sincerity. "It's not easy to admit when we've made mistakes, but I think you're on the right track." Arthur appreciated her words more than he could express. "Thank you, Clara. I have a lot of work to do, but I'm ready for it." As the day came to a close, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The hospital was still the same busy, bustling place it had always been, but to Arthur, it felt different. He was no longer just a surgeon moving through his duties with cold efficiency. He was part of something bigger, a community that he had neglected for too long. For the first time in years, Arthur felt like he was reconnecting with the reason he had become a doctor in the first place. It wasn't about prestige or accolades. It was about helping people, about making a difference in their lives, no matter how small. And now he was ready to embrace that calling once again. The next day, Arthur arrived at the hospital early once again, determined to continue on the path he had set for himself. As he walked through the corridors, he could sense that people were starting to notice a shift in his behavior. The staff, who had once been wary of him, now greeted him with tentative smiles and nods. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was something. A sign that perhaps they were beginning to see the effort he was putting into being different. Arthur headed to his first patient of the day, a young man recovering from surgery. As he entered the room, the patient's eyes brightened with surprise. Arthur took a seat beside the bed rather than standing above him and asked, "How are you feeling today?" The patient smiled, still a bit groggy from the procedure. "Better, I think. Thank you, doctor." Arthur nodded, genuinely pleased to see his patient improving. "I'm glad to hear that. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to ask. I'm here to help." The patient hesitated for a moment, then spoke up. "Actually, I was wondering how long the recovery process will be. Will I be able to go back to work soon?" Arthur took the time to explain the recovery timeline in detail, making sure the young man understood everything clearly. He answered every question with patience and thoroughness, something that, in the past, he might not have bothered to do. As he left the room, the patient smiled, clearly appreciative of the extra time and care. As the day went on, Arthur found himself engaging more deeply with each person he encountered. He didn't rush through consultations or brush off questions. Instead, he made an effort to connect, to understand, and to offer reassurance. With each small interaction, Arthur felt the weight of his old habits lifting. The hospital began to feel less like a place of work and more like a place of healing. Not just for the patients, but for him as well. Later that afternoon, Arthur received a message from the hospital director. He had requested a meeting with Arthur to discuss his recent behavior. Arthur felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. The director had been the one to warn him multiple times about his attitude toward patients and staff. And now, Arthur wondered what this conversation would bring. When he arrived at the director's office, Arthur took a deep breath before entering. The director, a man known for his calm and fair demeanor, greeted him with a nod. "Dr. Mendonça, thank you for coming," the director began. "I've heard from several staff members that they've noticed a change in your approach over the last couple of days." Arthur braced himself, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "I wanted to acknowledge the effort you've been making," the director continued, surprising Arthur. "It hasn't gone unnoticed. I've received positive feedback from patients and nurses alike. It's clear that you're taking the necessary steps to improve." Arthur let out a small sigh of relief, but he knew there was still more to say. "I appreciate that, but I also know that it's going to take time to undo the damage I've caused. I've let my pride and arrogance guide me for too long, and I know I have a lot of work to do to earn back the trust of the people here." The director nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. Change doesn't happen overnight, but what matters is that you're making a genuine effort. Keep going down this path, and in time, I believe you'll not only regain that trust, but also become a stronger leader within this hospital." Arthur felt a surge of hope at the director's words. For the first time, he could see a future where he wasn't defined by his past mistakes, but by the steps he was taking to correct them. After the meeting, Arthur returned to his rounds, feeling more motivated than ever. As he walked through the halls, he passed Clara, the young nurse who had been instrumental in helping him confront his behavior. She smiled at him, and for the first time, Arthur felt like they were truly on the same team. He gave her a nod of acknowledgement, silently thanking her for the role she had played in his transformation. By the end of the day, Arthur felt exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion, one that came from genuine effort and care, not from simply going through the motions. As he left the hospital that evening, he thought about the many small moments that had led him to this point. Each interaction, each patient, each conversation had been a step towards something bigger. Arthur knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. It wasn't about being the best surgeon anymore. It was about being the best version of himself. And with every passing day, he was one step closer to achieving that goal. The following morning, Arthur arrived at the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. As he walked down the hallways, he could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. The once distant and guarded looks from his colleagues were now replaced with curiosity and cautious respect. It was clear that people had begun to notice the changes he was making, even if they weren't sure what to make of them just yet. But Arthur didn't expect immediate forgiveness or admiration. He knew he had to earn it. His first stop was the hospital's cafeteria, where he saw Clara sitting with a few other nurses. Normally, Arthur would have walked right past without a second thought, but today he made a different choice. He approached their table, his heart pounding slightly as he stepped into unfamiliar territory. "Morning, everyone," he said with a smile that felt more genuine than any he had given in years. The nurses looked up, a bit surprised to see him there, especially without the usual sense of urgency or distance that typically followed him. "Morning, Dr. Mendonça," Clara said, offering him a small smile. Arthur took a breath and then did something he hadn't done in a long time. He sat down with them. The table grew quiet for a moment, everyone unsure of what to say, but Arthur broke the silence. "I just wanted to thank you all for your hard work. I know I haven't always shown it, but I really do appreciate everything you do for the patients here. You're a big part of what makes this hospital run." The nurses exchanged glances, clearly surprised by his words. Clara smiled warmly, and the tension eased. "Thank you, doctor. It means a lot to hear that." Arthur nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He didn't stay long, but the brief interaction felt like a small step in the right direction. He knew that rebuilding relationships wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start. Later that day, Arthur found himself called into surgery for a particularly difficult case. The operation was complex, but this time, Arthur approached it differently. He made sure to communicate clearly with the surgical team, asking for their input and ensuring that everyone felt valued in the process. It wasn't the way he used to operate, where he would dominate the room with his presence and make decisions without consulting anyone else. The surgery was a success, and afterward, Arthur took a moment to thank each member of the team personally. It wasn't lost on them that this was a significant change from the Arthur they had known. The scrub nurse, who had worked with him for years, gave him a nod of approval, and even the anesthesiologist commented on how smoothly the procedure had gone, not just because of Arthur's skill, but because of the teamwork he fostered. As the day wore on, Arthur received a message that Dr. Silva had been discharged from the hospital and had left a note for him. Curious, he made his way to the nurse's station to pick it up. When he unfolded the paper, he found a simple, handwritten message. "Arthur, thank you for everything. Remember, change is a journey. Don't give up. Henrique Silva." The words hit Arthur harder than he expected. Dr. Silva had been patient, kind, and understanding when Arthur didn't deserve it. And now, even as he left the hospital, he offered encouragement. Arthur folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket, feeling a renewed sense of commitment to his journey of change. That evening, Arthur decided to take a walk through the hospital gardens to clear his mind. As he strolled through the peaceful greenery, he reflected on how much his perspective had shifted in just a few days. He had gone from being a surgeon who saw patients as problems to be solved, to someone who was beginning to see them as people, individuals with stories, fears, and hopes. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the hospital, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He wasn't sure where this new path would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to keep walking it. Arthur returned to the hospital the next day, determined to keep improving. He approached his colleagues with more humility, and he found that, in return, they began to open up to him. Slowly, the walls he had built around himself started to come down, and Arthur felt himself reconnecting not only with the people around him, but with his purpose as a doctor. It would be a long road, but Arthur was no longer walking it alone. He had learned an important lesson, that healing wasn't just for patients. Sometimes the doctors needed it too. And for the first time in years, Arthur allowed himself to believe that he could be healed. He had a long way to go, but he was finally on the right path. The next few days passed in a blur of patient care and personal reflection. Arthur had made it a point to show more compassion, more patience with everyone he encountered, and it was starting to have an effect. The hospital staff, who had once avoided his presence, were now beginning to engage with him more freely. It wasn't a dramatic shift. He knew that trust, once broken, took time to rebuild, but it was happening slowly. One morning, as Arthur sat in his office preparing for his rounds, he received an unexpected visit from the head of nursing, a stern but fair woman named Maria, who had worked at the hospital for as long as he could remember. She stood at his door, arms crossed, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Dr. Mendonça," she said, her voice formal as always, "may I have a word?" Arthur gestured for her to sit, unsure of what to expect. Maria wasn't someone who typically engaged in small talk, so he knew whatever she had come to say was important. "I've noticed the changes in your behavior," she began, her eyes fixed on him. "It's clear you're making an effort, but I need to know if this is something that's going to last." Her directness caught Arthur off guard, but he respected it. Maria was known for speaking her mind, and he appreciated that she wasn't tiptoeing around the issue. "I understand your concern," Arthur replied, meeting her gaze. "I know that my reputation isn't the best, and I don't expect people to believe that I've changed overnight. But I am committed to this. I've realized how wrong I was, and I'm working on being a better doctor and a better person." Maria nodded slightly, but didn't let him off the hook so easily. "It's not just about how you treat the patients, Dr. Mendonça. It's also about how you treat the staff. The way you've spoken to the nurses over the years hasn't gone unnoticed." Arthur felt a pang of guilt. He had spent years disregarding the contributions of the nursing staff, seeing them as merely part of the process rather than essential partners in patient care. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been dismissive and disrespectful, and I regret that. I want to fix it. I know it will take time, but I'm going to show everyone, especially the nursing staff, that I've changed." Maria studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Words are one thing, Dr. Mendonça. Actions are another. But I'll be watching, and so will everyone else." Arthur nodded in return, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. This wasn't just about making apologies. It was about proving, day after day, that he was committed to this change. After Maria left, Arthur sat back in his chair, thinking about the importance of that conversation. It had been a reality check, but one he needed. If he was going to truly make amends, he had to be consistent in his efforts. There would be no shortcuts. That afternoon, Arthur was scheduled to consult on a difficult case, a young boy who had been admitted after suffering severe injuries in a car accident. The boy's condition was critical, and Arthur felt a sense of déjà vu as he entered the room, reminded of his own son's near-fatal accident years ago. The boy's parents were by his bedside, their faces drawn with worry. Arthur introduced himself, speaking softly, trying to ease their fears. As he explained the procedure he would need to perform, he made sure to take the time to answer their questions and reassure them. The old Arthur would have rushed through the explanation, but today, he knew better. These people needed more than just a doctor. They needed someone who understood what they were going through. After the consultation, Arthur met with the surgical team to prepare for the operation. As they scrubbed in, he made a point to acknowledge the expertise of each member of the team, something he hadn't done in years. It felt right, and he could sense a shift in the way they responded to him. They were no longer just following orders. They were working alongside him as a team. The surgery was long and difficult, but in the end, it was successful. The boy's life had been saved, and as Arthur left the operating room, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Not just for the boy, but for himself. He was slowly rediscovering what it meant to be a doctor, not just in skill, but in heart. Later, as Arthur visited the boy's parents to give them the good news, he saw the look of pure gratitude in their eyes. It reminded him of how he had felt when his own son had been saved by Dr. Silva. This time, Arthur didn't take that gratitude for granted. He accepted it humbly, knowing that the real reward was in having made a difference. As Arthur walked back through the hospital, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had a long way to go, but every day, every patient, every conversation was a step forward. The road to redemption was not an easy one, but it was one worth traveling. Arthur had once believed that being a great doctor meant being the best at what you did. Now he understood that it was about more than that. It was about the people you served, the connections you made, and the lives you touched, not just through your skills, but through your kindness. And Arthur was ready to keep walking that path, one step at a time. In the weeks that followed, Arthur continued his transformation. He didn't expect things to change overnight, but slowly he began to see the impact of his efforts. The staff, once wary of him, started to interact with him more freely. The nurses, in particular, responded to his new approach with cautious optimism. They were used to the old Arthur, the one who barely acknowledged them. But this new Arthur was different. He listened, he thanked them, and most importantly, he showed respect. One afternoon, Arthur was called into a meeting with the hospital director, along with other senior staff members. As they sat around the conference table, discussing upcoming changes in hospital policies, Arthur felt more aware of the dynamics in the room. In the past, he had dominated conversations, convinced that his opinions were the only ones that mattered. But today, he listened carefully to what others had to say, contributing when necessary, but also giving space for others to speak. During the meeting, the director looked at him and said, "Dr. Mendonça, I've been hearing positive things about your work recently. It seems you've taken the feedback to heart." Arthur nodded. "I have, and I'm committed to making sure it stays that way." The director gave him a small smile of approval before continuing with the meeting. Arthur felt a sense of pride, not the pride he used to feel, born from arrogance, but a quiet pride in knowing he was doing better, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Later that day, Arthur was called to consult on a case involving an elderly woman with a complicated medical history. She had been admitted with severe chest pains, and the diagnosis was uncertain. Arthur, alongside a team of doctors and nurses, reviewed her condition. As they discussed potential treatment plans, Arthur noticed how collaborative the environment had become. The nurses were contributing their insights without hesitation, and Arthur found himself valuing their input in a way he hadn't before. He was learning to appreciate the fact that healthcare wasn't just about doctors making decisions. It was about a team working together, each person bringing their expertise to the table. After the consultation, Arthur stayed behind to speak with the patient's daughter, who was clearly anxious about her mother's condition. He took the time to explain the situation, walking her through the treatment options with patience and empathy. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It means a lot to know that my mother is in good hands." Arthur smiled, touched by her words. "We'll do everything we can to make sure she gets the best care," he assured her. As he left the room, Arthur felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't just about performing surgeries or making diagnoses anymore. It was about connecting with the patients and their families, about being there for them in their moments of fear and uncertainty. That evening, Arthur found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He thought about Dr. Silva's words, the advice he had given before leaving the hospital. "Change is a journey," Dr. Silva had said. And Arthur now understood the truth of those words more deeply than ever. He remembered the note Dr. Silva had left for him, which he kept in the pocket of his white coat as a reminder of the road he was on. Every time he felt doubt creeping in, or when the pressure of his old habits tried to resurface, Arthur would read those words again. "Don't give up." One day, after a particularly long shift, Arthur was walking through the hospital corridors when he spotted a young medical resident struggling with a patient file. The resident looked overwhelmed, lost in the maze of paperwork and the stress of learning the ropes. Arthur walked over to him and said, "Need a hand?" The resident looked up, surprised. "Oh, Dr. Mendonça, yes, actually, I could use some help." Arthur smiled and sat down beside him, guiding the young doctor through the file and offering advice on how to handle the case. It was a small act, but it meant a lot to the resident, who had heard stories about Arthur's intimidating reputation. Now he was seeing a different side, a doctor willing to help, to teach, and to support those coming up in the profession. As Arthur left the hospital that night, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He knew that the work of changing, of becoming better, was never really done. It was a continuous process, one that required humility, patience, and perseverance. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly on the right path. He had started this journey not knowing where it would lead, only that he needed to change. Now, he understood that the destination wasn't the point. It was the steps he took along the way that mattered. Arthur was no longer the man he once was. He was learning, growing, and becoming the doctor and the person he had always wanted to be. And that, he realized, was enough. Months had passed since Arthur began his journey of change, and though the path had been challenging, it had also been rewarding. Every day, he was reminded of the importance of humility, kindness, and patience, not just with his patients, but with himself as well. The hospital staff had grown accustomed to the new Arthur, and slowly but surely, they began to trust him again. One morning, as Arthur was preparing for his rounds, he received an unexpected phone call from the hospital director's office. Curious, he made his way down the hall to the director's office, wondering what this meeting might be about. When he arrived, the director greeted him with a warm smile. "Dr. Mendonça, I wanted to speak with you personally," the director began. "We've noticed the changes you've made over the past few months, and I think it's safe to say you've earned the respect of the entire hospital staff. It hasn't gone unnoticed." Arthur felt a sense of pride and relief, knowing how hard he had worked to rebuild his reputation. "Thank you," he replied. "I've done my best to make things right." The director nodded. "And you have. In fact, there's something we'd like to propose." He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "We're opening a new mentorship program for young doctors and medical students. We'd like you to be a key part of that program, guiding the next generation of medical professionals." Arthur was taken aback. For years, he had been the surgeon everyone feared to work with. Now, they wanted him to be a mentor. The idea of helping young doctors find their way, something he had neglected in his own career, filled him with a deep sense of purpose. "I'd be honored," Arthur said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'd love to be a part of that." The director smiled. "I knew you'd say that. We'll make the formal announcements soon, but I wanted you to know first. Your journey has been an inspiration to many, and I think you'll have a lasting impact on the doctors who come through this hospital." As Arthur left the director's office, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His career had taken a turn he never could have predicted, but for the first time, he felt at peace with the direction it was heading. Later that day, Arthur was making his rounds when he encountered a familiar face in the hallway. Clara, the nurse who had played such an integral role in his journey of change. She smiled when she saw him, and Arthur felt a surge of gratitude toward her. "Clara," he said, stopping to speak with her, "I just wanted to thank you again. I don't think I ever fully expressed how much you helped me." Clara raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. "I think you've done a pretty good job of showing it, Doctor." Arthur chuckled softly. "Still, I owe you more than I can say. You were the one who made me see what I was doing wrong, and without that, I don't know where I'd be today." Clara shrugged, her expression softening. "You did the hard part, Dr. Mendonça. You changed. Not everyone would have done that." Arthur nodded, feeling the truth of her words. "Well, thank you. I couldn't have done it without you." As he continued his rounds, Arthur reflected on how much his relationships with the staff had evolved. He had once been feared, resented even, but now he was part of a team, a true member of the hospital community. His interactions with the nurses, doctors, and patients had transformed, and so had he. In the afternoon, Arthur was called to consult on a case involving a young girl who had been admitted with severe abdominal pain. The case was tricky, requiring a delicate balance of diagnostic testing and potential surgical intervention. Arthur gathered the team and went over the details, listening to the insights of the nurses and junior doctors before offering his own opinion. During the procedure, Arthur noticed how different the atmosphere in the operating room was compared to how it used to be. There was no tension, no fear, just a sense of shared purpose. The surgery went smoothly, and afterward, Arthur made sure to thank each member of the team personally. It had become a habit now, one that felt natural and necessary. That evening, as Arthur was preparing to leave the hospital, he received a call from home. His son, now a teenager, had been asking to visit the hospital to see where his father worked. Arthur realized how much he had kept his family at a distance during the years when his career had consumed him. But now, he wanted to share this part of his life with them. The next weekend, Arthur brought his son to the hospital. As they walked through the halls, Arthur found himself explaining not just the technical aspects of his work, but the importance of compassion, teamwork, and respect for others. Lessons he had learned the hard way. "Dad, is this where the doctor saved me after the accident?" his son asked as they passed the emergency room. Arthur nodded, a wave of emotion passing through him. "Yes, it is. And that doctor taught me a lot more than how to save lives. He taught me how to be a better person." His son looked up at him, clearly curious but too young to fully understand the depth of what Arthur was saying. Still, it felt good to share this moment, knowing how much had changed since that fateful day. As they left the hospital together, Arthur realized that the journey he had been on wasn't just about his career. It was about becoming the man he wanted to be, for his family, for his colleagues, and for himself. The road had been long and difficult, but Arthur knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And with every day, he was becoming the person he had always hoped he could be. A doctor who healed not just with his hands, but with his heart.